Wonderful. Good morning. Today you are hopefully in the right place. That'd be great. This is the What If It Happens webinar series. We are on day number 4, I believe. We're going to be doing the first of my wild card sessions. If you haven't already heard, you're going to need pen and paper. I promise you're going to need pen and paper. When For this particular activity, I also like to warn people, especially if you are multitasking or driving, a lot of this activity is in silence. So if you start thinking like, oh no, her microphone broke or the internet went out, that is possible, but it's unlikely because there's so much silence in this. But there's a countdown clock. I'm paying attention. I will be listening to the Supreme Court on my phone while muted. And so I'm here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that go along. Don't forget, follow me on the Instagram because that's what I'm supposed to be asking for. The texting number is 202-670-4262. Especially during the reflection parts. If you have any questions, feel free to text me or you can put them in the chat, but don't come off mute when I ask you to be quiet and doing your own work because that's disruptive for everyone else. You are going to need pen and paper for this activity. I think I've said that 14 times now, but people keep coming in. So you are going to need pen and paper. Why I like this process, and I'm using the word process on purpose. The last 2 webinars and other ones that are coming up are very content heavy. I was talking with a friend of mine and she is an amazing speaker and an amazing teacher, and I can see her face. Hi, Regina. And one of the things that she said that was really powerful for me was that there is a lot of content shoved into these webinars, but yet somehow I'm like charming and funny and delightful. Regina, I'm paraphrasing. And so it doesn't seem like I'm covering a lot of ground, but I am covering a lot of ground. And so in a series, today is the day where we get to like breathe a little bit. So I have challenged you for 3 days now to focus on yourself. And so today is going to be so focused on yourself that most of the webinar is silent. Why that is that ultimately we are all trying to do better. Not 100% of the time. Whoa, lower your expectations, but just occasionally, some of the times, to do better, to do the best we can with what we got some of the time. That's my motto. So when we start talking about ally and advocacy work, what I find is a lot of good intended allies are adding so much stuff on top of them and in their minds that the weight of that can make doing something or doing the right thing almost impossible because you'd have to do it out from inside of all of that pile up. So we're going to squeegee that away today and just work with you as you are. Some of you might be like, that is not a good choice. I agree. I'm a hot mess. But that's the real ally advocacy work that I want to help you find as a participant in this webinar series. So you are going to need pen and paper for this activity, just in case you thought the other 47 times that I said that I was kidding. You are going to need pen and paper, not an iPad, not something that's on the screen that you're watching. And if you're doing something where you can't draw along, I would highly recommend watching the recording because you're going to need to be able to have raucous conversations with yourself. For this particular activity, the way the process works is I'm going to move you through 4 different prompts. You can go back to other prompts at any point in time, and you're not going to fax me your answers so that you don't have to, you're only editing for yourself, if that makes any sense. So anything that comes up when you're answering one of the prompts and you decide not to put it down on your sheet of paper, that is a conversation between you and your therapist, not me. I'm not going to see your answers, but I want to take you through this process so that you can see kind of where you're at. It'll help keep what you want to keep, edit what you want to edit, and then notice potentially what's incongruent. And that's not a ghost, that's Leo. He is up and about this morning. So you're going to need pen and paper. When you get your pen and paper, you're going to divide your pen and paper into 4 quadrants. My heady people, I see you. My heady people will say, oh, but is it an X or a plus? Or you'll get a ruler or you start folding sheets of paper. You're taking notes for yourself. So just divide it into 4 quadrants. A plus or an X sounds great. And then you're going to number each quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pat, I should probably tell you this, since you're deputized, if people come in at a different time, I am fairly decent at kind of like quickly catching people up to where we're at, so you don't have to do anything. You just get to play yourself. It's a big enough job. Okay, so if you have a sheet of paper, you have drawn 2 lines across the sheet of paper somehow and made 4 areas. Then you have numbered those 4 areas. So far, this is the hardest part of the program. What do we mean? Draw an X, draw a plus, 1, 2, 3, 4. Which one is number 2? Doesn't matter, just label it number 2, and then suddenly, poof, it becomes number 2. So good, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lead you through a prompt for each one. I have a timer. Those of you that are like super action oriented, I'm just gonna interrupt. That's how you're gonna know your time's over, and we're gonna move on to the next prompt. But if the next prompt makes you think of something, you can go back to the original prompt because you have the sheet of paper and this is a virtual webinar. Good morning, it's Thursday. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm gonna read each prompt. I'm gonna say it again, and then I'm gonna put it into the chat just in case. There may be moments of kind of like, well, what do you mean by this word? Or do you mean at work? Do I mean at home? Yep, sounds great. What I'm gonna ask you to do is to internalize the prompt. Read the prompt, hear the prompt, watch me say the prompt. And then anything that comes up for you across any point in time in your life, it doesn't even have to be in chronological order. I want you to reflect on messages you have learned related to that prompt. Good, bad, ugly, awesome. They can be keywords, they can be draw pictures, they can be full sentences, whatever it is you want to do. Basically, each prompt is asking you to leave breadcrumbs for yourself about yourself. Do you see how meta this just got? You're leaving breadcrumbs for yourself, about yourself, and then we're going to reflect on it all later of like the messages you have learned of how you got to where we're at. We'll be doing this process in this series a number of times, and each time we're focusing on a different lens. So today's messages I learned lens is race and racism. Why not start small? So I like to start with race and racism because usually, even if you haven't had that much access to diversity or social justice training, we are confronted with what is race or what is racism almost always, because it's just how our culture works. We can talk about that later if you want. So when you are answering the prompts, we are only focusing on race, our race, other people's race and racism or acts of racism. That is the only focus today. So if you want to chat me, but like, what about ability? That's a different day. We're going to do that on a different day. Make sense? So race and racism, let's do it. So once you have your paper divided into 4 and you understand that the prompt is coming, I'm going to mute, going to listen to the Supreme Court and watch a clock. And then I'm going to tell you when you're about halfway, and then I'm going to tell you when you're done, and then we're going to move on to the next prompt. And I might put updates of what's happening in the Supreme Court in the chat. You're welcome. I'm on your team. So if that's the case, we're going to get started. So prompt number 1 is messages that you learned about you. So because we're talking about race and racism, in quadrant number 1, you're going to write down everything that you have ever learned across your entire life about your particular racial identity. Some of us have never really had to check the box. I think it was 2004 before I, as a white person, was ever in like a white caucus space. And I remember in that moment, the group was told we're going to divide into like racial based caucuses. And I was like, but where will the white people go? I actually said that out loud. Things to say in a conference, not that. So I'd never been in a space of only white people by design before, right? Like I'd gone to a school and lived in a neighborhood that were only white, but I hadn't specifically been told I am a white person, which is a fascinating thing when you talk about how race and racism works. So I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to mute. Messages you learned about you, which means your particular race or racial identity. Sound good? If you have any questions, you're welcome to text message me. You can put them in the chat, but I'm going to ask you to not unmute until I tell you to engage again. Okay? Go talk to yourself. Okay, we're just about halfway through the first quadrant. A couple people have called in, so you may not be able to see the chat. You're getting a sheet of paper and a pen. You're dividing the sheet of paper into 4 quadrants. That is nothing fancier than drawing a big X on your sheet of paper. You're numbering them 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to go through a silent reflection part, which that way, if you called in and you were like, what's wrong? There's no noise. It's because everyone's working. But what you're going to be doing is reflecting on your own life and the messages you have learned about the specific prompt related to race and racism. There's about 2 minutes left in quadrant 1. And quadrant 1 is messages that you have learned about your own racial identity throughout your whole life. They don't have to be in chronological order. And spoiler alert, you do not have to fax this to me. You're just having a conversation with yourself. So if you think of something and you're like, oh, I can't write that down, maybe make a note and talk about it in therapy. Okay, 2 minutes left, or just under 2 minutes. Okay, we are kind of winding down this quadrant. You can always come back to it. No pressure. Okay. We're gonna Taylor Swift for a second, shake it off a little bit. Some people, we really don't ever sit around and think about our racial identity. And I also want to be mindful that some people cannot navigate this planet without their racial identity being the first thing that other people think about or that they think about or how they're presenting. We're again talking about visible or invisible identities. Some of us have an identity that maybe isn't what is perceived by other people. So we have to kind of navigate what that means to be not enough in multiple different groups. Some of us don't ever have to think about this. It's like Fight Club. That's how privilege works. So spending 5 minutes reflecting on your entire life about your own racial identity for some is heavy. So I just want you to shake it off because this is the easy part. It's just getting harder. You're welcome. So now that quadrant 1 has been you taking 5 minutes to like really think about across your life, everything that you have learned about whatever it is that you racially identify as, what we're going to do is move to quadrant 2. And quadrant 2 is messages that you learned about other people with a different racial identity than your own. So no matter how you identify, awesome, that's quadrant 1. So in quadrant 2, it's just messages that you have learned about other racial identities. Not in chronological order, draw pictures, keywords, leave yourself some breadcrumbs. And good, bad, ugly, awesome. As a Southerner, there's a lot of things I learned that I am not supposed to commit to pen and paper. And remember, you're not turning the sheet of paper in, right? This is how racism works, is that we have all kinds of bad messages about certain groups, and we have model minority messages about other groups that we don't necessarily belong to. Please recall positive and negative, conscious and unconscious bias. So in quadrant 2, I want you to reflect on any messages across your lifespan that you have learned about people who have a different racial identity than you do. Okay, here's the clock. You're about halfway through this section. Take a breath. Notice how you feel right now versus how you felt about 5 minutes ago. In the home stretch of quadrant 2, go ahead, try to remember to breathe. That's probably the thing I'm the worst at, but my therapist always makes me do it. Just notice what it feels like. How you doing? What's going on over there, right? Now, if I can review, quadrant 1 is messages that you learned about your own racial identity. Stellar. Quadrant 2 is messages you learned about other people's racial identities, right? Like easy enough, hard work, maybe, sometimes maybe a little uncomfortable, maybe super academic, maybe you're crawled up in your head. This is what I want you to do. I want you to look at your sheet of paper and I want you to notice, who did you leave out? And what I mean by that is this is yesterday's little binary situation, because what ends up happening is we can do ourselves, which sometimes is a little complicated, right? And we do other people. But when we do the other people, we tend to pick the extreme of the other people or a few of the other people. So let's give other people some real estate. So quadrant number 3 is messages you learned about even more people other than yourself, because they likely didn't show up in quadrant 2. So whoever, you're going to have to notice who you didn't cover in quadrant 2. And then now they got space. So then what are messages you learned about them? Oftentimes, because we're super binary, so as a white person, for example, I might talk about being white in quadrant 1, and then in quadrant 2, I would talk about being Black, being Latino, being Asian, like the big categories, right? But I wouldn't necessarily think about other racial identities that aren't the big categories. So what about being biracial or multiracial? What about being Arab? What about being indigenous? What about being native? What, like, there's a lot of other racial identities that don't like instantly come within the 4-minute times that you're supposed to reflect on. And sometimes that's by design, because we just deal with what we deal with. If I was a person of color, I would imagine being white is going to show up in quadrant 2 for sure. But who isn't going to show up in quadrant 2? So quadrant 3, here's your time. Messages that you've learned about even more people other than yourself. You're about halfway. Okay, we're wrapping up quadrant 3. Again, as a review, quadrant 1. Oh, what? I just got a phone call and it moved my slides. Weird. Decline. Great. Focus. Quadrant 1 is messages you learned about your own racial identity. Quadrant 2 is messages you learned about other people's racial identity. Quadrant 3 is yet even more other people's racial identity, right? Okay, so quadrant 4 is specifically, I want you to record across your life times that you engaged in collusion or participating in a racist act. Now, I can already hear some people rock back on their heels and say, I have never in my entire life. Yes, you have. It happens regularly, even when you're super conscious of it. And it also happens even if you identify as not a white person. So let me give you a little bit of how I'm using the word collusion and participate. So collusion means some shenanigans are occurring and you didn't stop it. You weren't necessarily involving, but you knew about it, or maybe you didn't know about it in the present moment, but you found out about it later, but you didn't stop it. So you passively colluded, or you actively colluded in the shenanigans, or you actually participated in the shenanigans. Now, again, because of binaries and extremes, when I say we participated in an act of racism, most of our brains immediately go to very, very like violent, discriminatory, obvious, horrible things to do. I would hope most of us have not done that, but I can't know, and you don't need to tell me. What is important to know is that acts of racism, when you're talking about power and privilege, can be really, 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 really subtle. They don't actually have to be acts of violence. If I think of the number of times that I walked up to a cashier and probably got served before the person of color who was already there before me, I'm not even conscious of how many times that has probably happened. But I am also not conscious of when I have stepped in front of a person of color and gotten served first. Does that make sense? So one is collusion. I saw it happen. I didn't do anything about it, or heard about it later and didn't do anything about it. And participating is actively doing something in the act of racism. So I want you to leave notes for yourself. You're not going to have to share this out for anybody else. I just want you to take note of it and leave yourself some breadcrumbs. So here's some time on the clock. Point of clarification, you are leaving breadcrumbs about the messages you learned about when you realize you colluded and when you realize you participated. That's the messages you learn. You don't have to report out what the whole event is. You're more than halfway through. All right. I am assuming that you have made it through all 4 quadrants. I've gotten some very good questions over text. I promise we are going to get to those. But until then, what I would like for you to do is flip your sheet of paper over. You're going to flip your sheet of paper over, or if you're using little bits, you're going to just need flip them all over. Draw another X. And breathe. Also, remember to do that breath thing. It's free. Doesn't even take a copay. Remember, if you do have any questions or comments or something, you're welcome to text message me at 202-670-4262. I'm happy to answer them via text. We're going to talk about some of these in person, or in person, I mean live on the webinar. So I've flipped your sheet of paper over and I want you to divide it up into 4 more quadrants, plus or X. I want you to label the top 2 as easy and hard. And then I want you to take a second and I want you to write down what right now is easy and hard. Jessica, what do you mean? Do I mean about the activity? Do I mean about your life? Like what? Yes, sure, whatever. It's your sheet of paper. When oftentimes we do reflective things, I think another kind of meta level of doing a reflective activity is what was easy and what was hard about the time that you spent using the reflective activity, the time in the reflective activity, after the reflective activity, all of that. Just how you doing right now? What was easy and what was hard, and put it on a sheet of paper. Easy and hard. Okay. Then as you're kind of wrapping up easy and hard, the next 2 quadrants is next and promise. The whole point of being reflective and taking responsibility of the messages that you have learned across your own life is about what are you going to do next? And for some of us, we might have come up with something in that reflective activity that is kind of identified something that we need to do next. Or perhaps we're going to make a promise to ourselves or a promise to others, a promise to your accountability people. What is next? And what is a promise that you may or may not need to hold yourself accountable to? So I wanted to give you space for it. Easy, hard, next, and promise. Great. I have made breakout rooms randomly. So some of people maybe from work, etc. I just did it random. And what I want you to do is I want you to spend some time just talking to whoever you randomly end up in a group with about easy, hard, next, and promise. You're just going to share whatever it is you want to share with a total random stranger, more than likely, about what was easy, hard, next, and promise. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. So 5 minutes per person. Go join your breakout group. Easy, hard, next, and promise. See you in 10 minutes. Those of you that don't want to join breakout groups, you're welcome to do it with us in here. You can talk to me. You can use this moment as a reflection. They're kind of a choose your own adventure. Kendra, I'm going to move you into room 6. Oh, that's totally fine, Sean. For those of us that are still in what I call the hotel lobby, I debate doing breakout groups because I think they got overdone so much during COVID. And I also think it's really interesting to put people in breakout groups, not to talk about the first 4 prompts, where messages I learned about race and racism, but to talk about the prompts of easy, hard, next, and promise. So then when they come back, we'll see what ends up happening. Also, if you were interested on like a facilitation level, what ends up typically happening is that they just had an authentic conversation, basically with a stranger. And it's important to remind people that that's what having a real conversation is. You don't even actually have to even know the person in advance. Um, and some people don't like breakout groups. So here we are. Hi, friends. Sean, I just realized you sent that directly to me, and I commented out loud. Either way, we're totally fine. There's about 7 minutes left if you need to go get like a refill on your beverage or something. Friends, they have about a minute. They're automatically closing in a minute. Welcome back. Welcome back. So first off, take a breath. That might be nice. Number two, I tried the voice thing, which I typically find very creepy, but I thought it might be appropriate that those of you that were in breakout rooms, when someone is interrupting a very good conversation, I want us to remember what that feels like. It's possible some of the breakout rooms you were not having a great conversation, so you were like, oh, thank God. But if you were having a great conversation and then I interrupted it or closed the breakout rooms before you were done, that's a sign that you're having an authentic conversation. They are free. So please remember the feeling. And that is how you know you could be doing that again and more and often, because authentic conversations are really the only way we're going to connect with each other. So now that you are breathing and we are back in the full group, what I want us to do is to think about easy, next, hard, promise, whichever order you want to. Was one of them more comfortable for you to share in a breakout space with probably a stranger? Was there stuff that you absolutely knew you were not going to say? When I threw you into breakout rooms, did you panic that you were going to have to share about the other side of your sheet of paper, even though I told you that you would never have to share it with anybody else? What I really would like to do, and you can put it in the chat or you can unmute and have a conversation. That's really what I would like, is what is something that came up for you that was easy in, let's say, the last 51 minutes? I'll give you a container. So in the last 51 minutes, what has been easy? You can put it in the chat, you can text message it to me, or you can unmute and say it out loud.
It's easy to come up with stereotypes.
Very, right? Sometimes we even, at least for me, when I am acknowledging a stereotype, I feel like, oh, I'm going to win this one. And then it somehow becomes competitive of like, what are the worst stereotypes? We also have negative, or we have positive stereotypes as well, but those don't usually come up first. Great. Amy's sharing Easy's listening to messages I learned about, or listing messages I learned about other racial identities, right? Because we're very good at studying them over there. Spoiler alert, when someone is giving you feedback and your response is, you don't know me, it's the same muscle as how easy it is for you to reflect on them over there. Those people are giving you feedback because they are doing this to you. So maybe we should listen to them. They have a different perspective. Great. It's easy to think about how I've been racist in my past. I'm still ruminate on the shame. Okay, great. I would invite you, you are welcome to hold on to your shame, but I would also invite you that being judged for things that you did in your past, you can't undo, but you are responsible for them moving forward. And by trying to do something that you deem as better than what you did before is a learning process, and it's taking responsibility. And that should kind of diffuse some of the shame, if that's helpful. Great. Other thoughts, comments about easy? Anybody want to share anything that was hard? Either for you or discuss in your breakout groups, talking with someone else?
For me, it was messages I learned about my own race was the hardest one.
And do you mind if I ask a follow-up?
Go for it.
Was it hard because you haven't thought about it, or was it hard because of the messages you have learned about your own racial identity are hard to kind of bring back up?
The second one, because it was just everything I know about my race is mostly about hurting other people.
Got it. So it's kind of painful to think about what you do know.
Yeah.
Right. Which is also interesting, right? So sometimes we talk about like internalized oppression, or we talk about externalized oppression. And so this is a good time to kind of invoke both of those. There are times where our own behaviors really hold us back from behaving differently because we use our past behaviors as a reason that we're not good enough, no pun intended, to do different behaviors moving forward. Sometimes the messages we have learned about ourselves, and to use this example, are so negative that we have a very hard time getting out of that space. That's kind of that internalized like limitation or oppression place, right? And
Mhm.
that's also really powerful, right? And part of the reason that when I think of invisible identities, and part of the reason they don't get shared out more frequently is there's usually some kind of internalized force that we're going to be judged or left out or rejected because of this thing that people don't know about us. So we have to pick and choose to share that thing. That's kind of that internal force. So I think it's a really important thing to pay attention to. When we talk about oppression, we almost always are talking about externalized oppression and what legally people are allowed to do or not allowed to do, or when they break the laws, or what's happening out here. But that internal piece is really powerful. So I appreciate you naming it inside of hard. Thinking about the times I colluded with racism, also very challenging, and kind of like an Instapot natural release. I think if you can think about it and take responsibility for it, and then try to do your best not to do that again, you can learn from your own life and it will release a little bit of that pressure. And you also don't get to just squeegee it away. Like it is a part of who you are.
Yeah.
Any other hards? One of the questions that I haven't answered yet from text that I wanted to bring up before we conclude this particular workshop is, what is the difference between ethnicity and race? And I'm going to throw in the bonus of culture. So what is the difference between culture, ethnicity, and race? And the frustrating answer that I'm going to give you is it depends on the person that you're talking about. And what I mean by that is that the person that you're talking about, if you're asking on behalf of someone else how they identify or what their experience is, you need to ask them what they find is culturally relevant, ethnically relevant, or racially relevant to their identity. In this context of the conversation that came in on text, it was talking about other groups. And so the question that was invoked was, is a Jewish person, is that a racial identity, a religious identity, or an ethnic identity? And the answer is yep, because it can depend. So you might hear somebody say that they were raised culturally Jewish. So then that might mean some of the cultural practices of the Jewish community were part of their childhood or how they were raised, but they don't necessarily practice the religious part, right? That's a possibility. There is also a group membership that is identified as being a Jew or being Jewish or being part of the Jewish community that some people would say is cohesive enough to be a racial identity. And then how one does or how one performs being a member of a Jewish community would be the different kinds of ethnic decisions or choices or neighborhoods or customs or traditions or norms within that kind of community group. If you're slightly confused, please know I don't identify as a Jewish person, and it varies by person, by household. So that's why you would need to ask. But in an academic sense, you can sort of almost always decide that a racial category is a social constructed thing that's really big. It's the chocolate ganache layer. And then just inside that, that little crunchy caramel layer that happens might be the ethnic choices or ethnic habits, traditions, norms that are happening within the person or that particular person's neighborhood or family. And then their culture is what holds it all together. So culture is like sugar, not the almond inside. That's the person. But sugar is created in the whole thing. Now I really want chocolate. That might be a way of kind of clarifying it. They are often conflated together. So if it's confusing, it's because it's confusing. But I would even say, I am new to California, even though I have lived here for 20 years. I have not adjusted to what I would say is the culture of California, but I am very aware that there is a difference between Northern California and Southern California. Northern California people make fun of Southern California people, and everybody makes fun of people from San Diego, it seems. Okay, didn't know. So I don't know why those things are, but I've lived in enough places in other parts of the United States to know that there's the stereotype of California is LA, but California is a very, very large state, and I do not live anywhere that looks like LA. Does that make sense? So that's why it's kind of nuanced, even though I could give you an academic answer. We are at the top of the hour because I answered that question too long. So one, I want to make sure that you know about the book club. I got a bunch of inquiries yesterday, so there's some momentum building, which is very exciting. You can sign up for the book club before the end of the webinar series. We're going to do a group internally, and if your team wants me to come and do an internal group with your team, I'm happy to do that too. Just make sure you sign up before the end of the webinar series. It's probably the last time I'm going to do it. And we are honoring Crazy Horse Memorial. So if you have employer donations or something, please go to crazyhorsememorial.org/donation. You can use the QR code that I believe is a slide coming up. Today, I'm focusing on webinar series. I do these all the time for clients. Here's the donation thing. See, I just put them in the wrong order. Webinars like this usually are about 4 sessions. So it's the starting place, unconscious bias, usually one wild card like the one we did today. And then working across difference kind of ties up the series. If you're interested in a webinar series for your own organization, you can say, give me 10. And when you schedule an appointment with me, and you'll get 10% off of the webinar series that we book before the end of this webinar series itself. That was a meta thing to say. But you have been at Messages I Learned. I hope that this has been a helpful practice for you. Please be kind of gentle with yourself as you kind of go back into reality. Have some water, take some breaths, follow me on Instagram, whatever gives you peace. That would be great. And tomorrow is another wild card, which is an interactive activity. It's probably my most stolen activity. So it's not something you got to steal. I'll just give you the facilitation guide. But it really gets to judgments and assumptions. So that's Just Rescue. I'll see you same place, same time tomorrow at 8 o'clock Pacific. Can't wait. Don't forget to book me for your own webinar series. Bye, y'all.